The night shift as a janitor at the school I used to work in was always eerily quiet and never the good kind. The long, dimly lit hallways echoed with the slightest sound, and the shadows seemed to dance just beyond the reach of my flashlight. I'd heard rumors that someone was murdered there long ago, but whenever my shift came, I'd always hoped the rumors were nothing more than jokes meant to scare the little children there. I would soon find out just exactly what was behind the evil that lived in that school. It was past midnight, and a blizzard had blanketed the town in snow. It was wintertime, so getting that weather was alright. The school was empty of everyone except me, which I deeply enjoyed since I liked being alone, for the most part. As I mopped the floors of the gymnasium, I heard a noise, a locker slamming shut in the boys' changing room. Thinking it was just the wind, or perhaps the building setting, I continued my work. Hearing subtle noises every now and then was something you had to get used to when working in that school. Everything was at least a couple decades old. But then it came again, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Bare footsteps, to be specific, and abnormal ones at that. Curiosity overcame my initial hesitation, and I made my way to the changing room. I thought that if there was someone there, it'd likely be some kids playing pranks or doing some dare that required them to stay after school. The door creaked open, revealing rows of lockers and benches. The boys' changing room looked creepy, and I could feel a tension in the air that told me I should leave and get out of there. But I had to check and see, at least to settle my mind on the matter. Nothing seemed amiss until I saw it, a figure hunched over and rummaging through a locker. It was too large to be a student, its movements too deliberate. It made these gasping noises that sounded like it was difficult for the thing to breathe, and its body looked veiny and muscly. It was definitely not a person, and if it was, that person had to have been hit by a truck several times over and then boiled in hot water. "Hey!" I called out, my voice echoing off the tiled walls. "School's closed. You shouldn't be here." The figure stopped and slowly turned towards me. Every second of that moment filled me with unbearable dread as I realized the mistake I'd made. My heart sank as I met its gaze. Its eyes were a deep, unnatural color that might have been red, and its face, it wasn't human. It was as if someone had crudely stitched various animalistic features onto a person's face. It seemed to be an amalgamation of a bunch of unsettling looking things. The creature let out a guttural growl, a sound that chilled me to the bone. I stumbled backward, my mind racing. It rushed forward at me, moving faster than I could have ever expected. I had to get out and call for help, but the creature blocked the only exit. It opened its mouth, and out came voices of little children, all calling out to me to come closer. I figured that the creature must live in some secluded part of the school where it spied on children and learned to mimic their voice. It took a step towards me, and I did the only thing I could think of. I threw my mop at it and ran. I darted through the hallways, the creature's footsteps thundering behind me. I could hear its ragged breathing, feel its presence looming ever closer. I reached the main entrance and fumbled with the keys. The creature was almost upon me when the door swung open and I tumbled out into the snow. I didn't stop running until I reached the main road, where I flagged down a passing car. The driver must have seen the terror in my eyes, because he didn't hesitate to call the police. In ragged breaths, I tried to explain what I saw, but the panic in me wouldn't allow for the explanation to be completed. But when the police finally searched the school, they found nothing. No sign of forced entry, no strange footprints, nothing out of place. I quit my job the next day. I couldn't bring myself to step foot in that school again, especially not at night. People say I imagined it, that it was just the stress of the job. But I know what I saw. I feel bad for whoever else has to be the janitor of that place. Couldn't be me. Could never be me again. When you get bored, what do you do with that energy that's just waiting to get out? Some people manage to release it in better ways than others, but I was not one of those people. My boredom led me to try to challenge myself to make a YouTube video about staying in a grocery store from nighttime until it opened again. So there I was, crouched behind a fortress of toilet paper, my camera's red recording light the only thing betraying the darkness that enveloped me. The store had closed a couple of minutes ago, and my heart was still pounding from those moments when I had almost gotten caught by both customers and workers. But with no one there, I was beginning to think that the challenge would be a breeze. As I waited in the silence, there was this feeling inside me that didn't feel right. It might have been because I was in the store when I shouldn't have been. But honestly, this wasn't the first time I'd done something like this. I should have felt like I was alone, but I didn't. For some reason, it seemed like someone was wandering through the store, as though they were still shopping despite it being after hours. The silence was too heavy, too expectant. I held my breath, listening, and spent most of my time in silence rather than talking to my camera for the video. That's when I heard my ears pick up on a subtle sound, a soft shuffle, like footsteps muffled by the rows of products. Was there someone in here after all? I racked through my brain, searching for all the different possibilities of who could still be in the store. It couldn't be a worker. They'd have turned on the lights and not been by themselves. Suddenly, the thought came to mind that it could have been a burglar, and that really made my heart race. What if it was a burglar? What if they found me? Could I fend them off? But if I tried to get help, I would definitely get in trouble too. My thoughts were racing, and with me being more of a pessimistic person, I was thinking that the worst would happen. The more time passed by, the easier it became for me to hear the soft footsteps moving throughout the store. They sounded light, but at some points heavy. All in all, they were very irregular movements, like a person who didn't have the right mind and didn't have a purpose. But one thing became painfully clear. They were slowly but surely getting louder, meaning the person was probably getting closer to where I was. As much as I wanted to do the challenge for fun, I really didn't want to get seriously hurt doing it. So I decided that I would slowly and quietly try to make my way to a safer spot, one where I couldn't be found or reached easily. But right as this idea crossed my mind, the footsteps went from moving slowly to rushing forward at crazy speed. They sounded like they were coming towards where I was too quickly for me to react to. And just as they reached me, they stopped. At that moment, it sounded and felt like they were standing right in front of my hiding spot. I was terrified, more than terrified, because there was no way I believed for a second that it was a human. I looked out and could see nothing but darkness. The store wasn't that dark, so I could still see some things. So if someone was there, I was sure that I would see them. The silence was getting too much for me to bear. I came to the conclusion that the grocery store I was hiding in was haunted at night, since there were no other explanations I could give to what was happening. "Who's there?" I called out, more to break the silence than anything else. No answer. The store remained quiet. I tried to mentally laugh it off, but the sound died in my throat as a shadow flitted between the aisles. It was too tall, too thin to be human. My heart raced, thumping loud in my ears. I should have left then, but I didn't. Likely because I felt a mixture of fear and curiosity. The shadow didn't move and acted just like a normal shadow, only it wasn't connected to anything that I could make out. Then, all of a sudden, I could hear the creepiest of whispers coming from no specific direction. They sounded like they were in my head. The noises grew closer, a cacophony of whispers and soft, dragging steps. I peeked over my paper barricade and saw something that looked more than just a shadow, shrouded in darkness, its eyes glinting like shards of glass. It moved with purpose, searching. I turned off my camera, hoping the light wouldn't give me away, but it was too late. The figure stopped, its head tilting as if it could see me through the darkness. I held my breath, praying it would move on. I had made a big mistake deciding to hide out in here. With a sudden rush, it charged, knocking over shelves and sending products flying. I ran, my feet slipping on the glossy floor, my breaths coming in ragged gasps. The store that once seemed so familiar was now a labyrinth of terror. I could hear it behind me, always behind me, its breath a hiss of excitement. The front doors were in sight, the night air pressing against the glass, promising safety. I slammed into the doors, pushing, shoving, but they wouldn't budge. They were locked from the outside. I was trapped. The figure loomed over me, and I knew this was no challenge. This was survival. The thing had to have been some kind of ghost or paranormal entity that caused mischievous chaos at night when everyone was gone and was upset to see me there. I don't know when I blanked out, but I suddenly woke up back in my spot. I was still in the store, still alone. The light of the morning was almost blinding, and workers were beginning to make their way into the store. I kept myself hidden and listened to them talk as I tried to wrap my head around what had just happened. Then I heard one of them groan about how the products on the shelves kept falling to the floor as though they were knocked by something. One of them answered that at night there was this strange creature that would keep knocking things and creating messes. They said they saw it once, and that they were glad they didn't have to work at night when it was active because of how scary it was. Once I heard that, I made the decision that I would think more wisely before hiding out in just any store. The fact that something could be going on without you ever realizing is pretty crazy. And every now and then, I'll watch the video I made to remind myself of that fact. Of course, at certain points in the video, it suddenly cuts out, which it's never done before. So obviously, these creatures possess strange abilities that keep them unknown, at least until you have a creepy encounter with them. I had always been fascinated by the supernatural. Ghost stories, haunted houses, and paranormal investigations were my guilty pleasures. So, when my friend Mark suggested we try using a Ouija board in the old abandoned asylum on the outskirts of town, I couldn't resist. It was a chilly night, perfect for a spooky adventure. We arrived at the asylum just as the sun was setting. The building loomed over us, its windows shattered and walls covered in graffiti. The air was thick with the scent of decay and neglect. Mark and I made our way inside, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. We found a room that seemed relatively intact and set up the Ouija board on an old, dusty table. The planchette felt cold and heavy in my hands as we placed our fingers on it. Mark lit a few candles, casting eerie shadows on the walls. "Is anyone here with us?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, nothing happened, but then slowly the planchette began to move. My heart raced as it spelled out Y-E-S. "Who are you?" Mark asked, his voice trembling slightly. The planchette moved again, spelling out A-N-N-A, Anna. "Anna, what do you want?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The planchette spelled this out, and both mine and Mark's hearts were racing. It spelled out H-E-L-P, help. Before we could ask anything else, a loud crash echoed throughout the room. One of the candles had been knocked over, its flame extinguished. Mark and I exchanged nervous glances, but decided to continue. "How can we help you, Anna?" I asked. The planchette moved more quickly this time, spelling out L-E-A-V-E, leave. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped, and I could see my breath in the air. The candles flickered wildly, and I felt a cold breeze brush past me. Then, out of nowhere, objects started flying across the room. Books, chairs, and even pieces of debris were hurled around by an unseen force. "Mark, we need to get out of here," I shouted, my voice shaking with fear. We scrambled to our feet, knocking over the Ouija board in our haste. As we ran towards the door, I felt something cold and Clammy grabbed my ankle. I kicked frantically, breaking free and sprinting out of the room. We raced down the dark hallways, the sound of crashing objects and eerie whispers following us. My heart pounded in my chest as we finally burst through the front doors and into the night. We didn't stop running until we reached the safety of Mark's car. Breathless and terrified, we sat in silence for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. I glanced back at the asylum, its dark silhouette looming against the night sky. "Let's never do that again," Mark said, his voice trembling. I nodded in agreement. The thrill of the supernatural had lost its appeal. I had no desire to return to that place or to use a Ouija board ever again. The experience had been too real, too terrifying. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had disturbed something that should have been left alone. The drive was just supposed to be a quick stop to get a big case of water I desperately needed. Nothing was supposed to happen on my way. But of course, most of life's events aren't exactly what you anticipate. Let me tell you what happened from the beginning. After getting in a good workout from the gym, the sun was starting to go down really fast. Me remembering I needed to buy another case of water, I drove on the road hoping I would make it before the store closed. I should have noticed that the environment was too eerily quiet. There was barely anyone driving on the road with me, which was unusual since even at night the area was usually bustling with activity from cars. But for the first time, it was like I was the only one driving. I had to wonder if there was some kind of holiday going on that I wasn't aware of, or if some extreme weather warning had been issued. Everything was too quiet, and it felt like my car was going in slow motion. Unfortunately, that's the part where things got worse. I was driving past a partially foresty area. It wasn't very big, but the trees were decently dense. Then, fading into view from out of those trees, came a slightly transparent silhouette of a person. I slammed on the brakes since I was afraid I was about to hit a person. As I screeched to a stop, my adrenaline at an all-time high, I was able to get a better view of the figure. It was somewhat humanoid and tall, and the way it moved across the street was strange. It slowly glided as though swimming through the air mesmerizingly. I couldn't make out any distinct features because parts of the thing kept blending into each other and changing form. I guess it must have been made out of some ethereal form or something. I gasped as I stared at the creature in incredible disbelief, unable to know what to say. Then the thing turned to look at me and stopped its weird motion. For a few seconds, it remained as still as I was. Then, without warning, it faded away out of existence. It was incredible to watch, to say the least. If it weren't for my foot moving to the gas without me thinking about it, I would have stayed there, and who knows what would have happened. I left that area at striking speed, and surprisingly, more cars started showing up, and people were walking around like normal. It was like the moment never happened at all. I'll never forget it. That was the first and last ghost-like thing I ever saw, and it was the strangest encounter I think I might ever have. That day still remains vividly in my mind, even though it happened years ago when I was just a kid. It was a really hot summer afternoon, and it felt like there'd been an intense heat wave that day. It was like the heat had been a warning for what would happen to me later that day, but of course, I wouldn't end up listening to it. I had been hanging around with my best friend at the park or something, and we had gotten into an engaging conversation. But like usual, that conversation quickly turned into a debate and then into a full-blown argument. In a short amount of time, we had gotten into a heated argument over something trivial. In a fit of anger, I stormed off, running into the dense forest that bordered our neighborhood. I remember I ran fast too. I think I'd been angrier than I'd been in a while. The trees loomed overhead, their branches intertwining to form a canopy that blocked out the sun, casting eerie-looking shadows on the forest floor. As I trudged deeper into the woods, my anger began to subside, replaced by a growing sense of unease. It was this strange blend of feelings that didn't feel like my own. To me, it was kind of like how birds and rabbits can tell a dangerous predator is around, even if they never see them. The forest was unusually quiet, the only sound being the crunch of leaves under my feet and my heavy breathing as I struggled to catch my breath. I had never ventured this far before, and the unfamiliar surroundings made me feel small and vulnerable. I was a kid after all, so it wasn't difficult for me to feel that way. Suddenly, I heard a rustling noise behind me, along with a big thumping sound that immediately got my attention. I spun around in a heartbeat, my heart pounding in my chest, but saw nothing. I told myself it was just a squirrel or a bird, because when you're little and terrified, it can be the worst experience in your life. But the feeling of being watched persisted. Deep down I knew I couldn't try to lie to myself forever. I quickened my pace, hoping to find my way back home, but the forest seemed to close in around me, the trees becoming thicker and more oppressive. My heart was beating so fast, I thought I'd pass out for sure, but right when I was at peak scaredness, I saw the thing that makes nightmares come true. A powerful beast you'd think only existed in stories. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the trees that looked like it was something it wasn't. But as I squinted, I realized it was something much more sinister and very real. Standing about 50 feet away, partially obscured by the underbrush, was a creature unlike anything I could have ever seen. It was tall, easily over 7 feet, with a muscular build covered in matted dark fur. Its head was that of a dog or wolf-like thing, but grotesquely distorted, with glowing yellow eyes that seemed to pierce through reality itself. It swayed unnaturally and twitched every now and then, but it wasn't looking at me, instead at something else in the far distance. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. When I could finally breathe, it came out in ragged breaths that echoed into the forest louder than I intended. Of all the times to make a mistake, did it have to be then? The creature's eyes locked onto mine instantly, and for a moment, neither of us moved. Then, it let out a low, guttural growl that sent shivers down my spine. Its lips curled back, revealing rows of sharp, yellowed teeth. I wanted to run, to scream, but my legs felt like they were made out of lead. Sensing my fear, it then proceeded to let out a roar that sounded unreal to me, like something that couldn't be made by any creature in the animal kingdom. The monster that I would later classify as being a dogman took a large step forward, its massive paws crunching the leaves beneath it. I could see its muscles rippling under its fur, and the sheer power it exuded was terrifying. It opened its mouth wider, and an even greater deafening roar erupted from its throat, echoing through the forest. The sound was filled with intense rage, and seeing how it could tear me to pieces and eat me before I could blink, it was probably hunger sounding in its voice as well. That was more than enough to break my paralysis. I turned and ran, my legs pumping furiously as I tore through the underbrush. Branches whipped at my face, and I stumbled over roots and rocks, but I didn't dare look back, not for a single second. The roar still echoed in my ears, and I could hear the creature crashing through the forest behind me, its heavy footsteps growing closer. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I burst out of the forest and into the open field near my house. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. When I finally dared to look back, it was gone, the forest silent once more. I never told anyone about what I saw because I was buried in deep denial about my encounter. Who would believe me when I didn't even believe myself? I honestly wouldn't be surprised if it had all been just some dream I just felt like was real. But something inside me wouldn't be satisfied if I just called it that. So here I am, telling my tale. The mountain loomed large before me, its jagged peaks cutting into the dusky sky like serrated blades. The last rays of the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows that stretched across the rugged landscape. I'd been hiking since morning, enjoying the solitude and the quiet that the mountains offered. But now, as the light faded, an uneasy feeling began to creep in. The trail, once so clear and inviting to me, seemed to twist and turn in unfamiliar ways. The map in my hand felt useless, a piece of paper against the vastness of the wilderness. I told myself I wasn't lost. I'd been hiking for years, navigating more challenging trails without issue. But as the minutes ticked by and the darkness closed in, doubt gnawed at the edges of my confidence. The trail markers I had been following disappeared, swallowed by the deepening gloom. I paused, listening to the wind whispering through the trees. Was that the sound of running water in the distance, or just the rustle of leaves? My heart rate quickened. I hadn't seen another hiker in hours. The last group I passed was descending, warning me about the rough terrain ahead. But I had laughed it off, eager for the challenge. Now, that laughter felt like a distant memory. I checked my phone, hoping to get a GPS signal, but it was no use. The mountains had swallowed the signal whole, leaving me isolated. The battery was draining faster than it should have been, a reminder that night was falling, and I was far from any help. I pocketed the phone and tried to steady my breathing. I had to stay calm. Panic wouldn't help me find my way back. I decided to retrace my steps, but the fading light played tricks on my eyes. Every shadow seemed to move. Every gust of wind carried a whisper that sounded just out of reach. The trees, once majestic and comforting, now appeared gnarled and twisted, their branches clawing at the sky. My footsteps crunched against the gravel, the sound unnervingly loud in the stillness. As I walked, the uneasy feeling grew into a tangible sense of dread. My thoughts turned dark, and I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched somewhere, somehow. I spun around, scanning the tree line, but there was nothing. Only the oppressive silence of the mountains at night. I cursed under my breath, trying to shake off the paranoia. Hours seemed to pass, though I couldn't be sure. Time was losing its meaning in the inky darkness. The temperature dropped, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me. My breath formed small clouds in the air, and I could feel the chills seeping into my bones. I needed to find shelter soon, or risk spending the night exposed to the elements. Then, as I crested a small ridge, I saw it. A structure loomed in the distance, barely visible in the faint light. It was a cave, or at least something that resembled one. The entrance was a dark gash in the side of the mountain, framed by jagged rocks. Relief washed over me. A cave could provide shelter, a place to wait out the night until I could find my way back in the morning. But as I approached, that sense of dread returned, stronger than before. The air felt heavier, almost suffocating, and an odd smell, like damp earth and something far worse, wafted from the cave. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to turn back. But I was tired, cold, and the thought of spending the night in the open was terrifying. I had no choice. Just as I was about to take a step closer, a sound froze me in place. A low, guttural moan echoed from within the cave, rising and falling like some sort of chant. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to listen. The sound came again, louder this time, and then it was joined by another, and another. I realized with horror that the sounds weren't moans, they were screams. Human screams, distorted and twisted, as if being filtered through some monstrous throat. My blood ran cold, and I took a step back, my legs trembling. The cave entrance seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, as if it were a living thing, breathing in the night air. I turned to leave, but something caught my eye. Movement near the cave. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but then I saw it clearly. A figure, or at least what I thought was a figure, emerged from the darkness. It was hunched and twisted, its limbs moving jerky, unnatural motions. The thing had no discernible face, just a mass of shadow that seemed to ripple and shift as it moved. It staggered forward, its body contorting in ways that defied logic. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to run, but I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. The creature, or whatever it was, seemed to sense my presence. It stopped abruptly, its head jerking in my direction. The air grew thick with an oppressive silence. Then, without warning, the thing let out a bone-chilling wail, a sound that made my skin crawl. I bolted. I ran harder and faster than I'd ever before, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could hear the creature behind me, its erratic movements crunching the gravel underfoot. My mind raced, every instinct pushing me to get away, to put as much distance between myself and that cave as possible. But the mountain was unforgiving. The trail had long since vanished, and I was running blind, crashing through the underbrush, barely aware of my surroundings. Branches whipped at my face, and I stumbled more than once, but I didn't dare stop. I could still hear the creature, its wails piercing the night, growing fainter as I ran, but still too close for comfort. I didn't know how long I ran, but eventually the sounds of pursuit faded, replaced by the relentless pounding of my heart and the rush of blood in my ears. My legs burned, and I was gasping for air, but I couldn't stop. Not yet. Finally, through the trees, I saw a flicker of light. Civilization. A campsite with people milling around, unaware of the horrors lurking in the mountains. I burst into the clearing, startling the group around the fire. They stared at me, wide-eyed, as I gasped out my story, struggling to make sense of what I'd seen. They didn't hesitate. Someone handed me a blanket, and another handed me a phone to call the police. As I spoke to the dispatcher, I realized how insane my story sounded. But I didn't care. I'd seen something in those mountains, something that defied explanation. When the police arrived, they took my statement seriously, though I could see the doubt in their eyes. They organized a search party and asked if I could show them the location. Despite my exhaustion, I agreed. I needed to know that I hadn't imagined it, that there was some explanation for what I'd seen and heard. We retraced my steps, the police officers shining their powerful flashlights into the darkness. The forest seemed different now, less menacing with the presence of others. But as we neared the ridge, that same sense of dread returned, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. When we reached the spot where I'd seen the cave, I stopped, pointing ahead. But as the beams of light swept across the landscape, my stomach dropped. The cave was gone. There was nothing but solid rock where the entrance had been. The officers exchanged glances, and one of them tried to reassure me, saying it was easy to get turned around in the mountains at night. But I knew what I'd seen. The creature, the cave, the screams, they were real. They had to be. We searched the area for hours, but found nothing. No signs of a cave, no traces of anything out of the ordinary. Eventually, the search was called off, and I was escorted back to the campsite. The officers left me with a stern warning to be careful, but I could see the disbelief in their eyes. To them, I was just a hiker who had gotten lost and let his imagination run wild. But as I lay awake that night, in the safety of a tent surrounded by others, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, lurking in the darkness, waiting for me. The mountains had secrets, and I had stumbled upon one of them. I knew I would never forget the sight of that twisted figure or the sound of those distant screams. And though the authorities found nothing, I knew the truth. There was something in those mountains, something that didn't want to be found. When I was younger, I had a doll that my grandmother had given me for my 5th birthday. It was one of those old-fashioned porcelain dolls with painted blue eyes, curly blonde hair, and a dress made of lace. My parents thought it was a charming, precious heirloom from my grandmother's childhood, but from the moment I laid eyes on it, I felt an inexplicable sense of unease. I tried to like the doll, I really did. I placed it on a small chair in the corner of my room, right next to my bookshelf. But no matter where I moved it, I always felt as if its glassy blue eyes were watching me, following me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. My parents told me I was just being silly, that it was just a doll and couldn't hurt me. So I kept it in my room, hoping I'd get used to it. But that never happened. At first, it was little things. I'd go to sleep with the doll on the chair, but when I woke up, it would be in a different position. Sometimes it was leaning against the bookshelf. Other times, it was lying on the floor. I tried to convince myself that I must have moved it in my sleep, maybe knocked it over while tossing and turning. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. One night, a few weeks after the doll arrived, I woke up feeling unusually thirsty. The house was quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs. I slipped out of bed, careful not to make too much noise, and padded down the hallway toward the kitchen. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I paused, suddenly gripped by a strange sensation, like I was being watched. The kitchen was dark, the only light coming from the dim glow of the clock on the microwave. I reached for a glass, but as I turned to the sink, I froze. There, lying on the counter, was the doll. Its blue eyes stared up at me, wide and unblinking. Its small hands posed as if it had been reaching for something. I hadn't brought the doll downstairs. I was certain of that. My parents had gone to bed hours ago, and they never touched the doll. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at it, too terrified to move. How had it gotten there? Suddenly, I felt a forceful shove from behind, and I was sent sprawling to the ground, the glass shattering beside me. I gasped in pain, my hands stinging from where the shards had cut into my skin. But the pain was secondary to the fear coursing through me. I scrambled to my feet, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I looked around the dark kitchen, trying to make sense of what had just happened. That's when I heard the sound, the whispers, soft, almost inaudible, but unmistakably real. They came from all around me, echoing off the walls, filling the room with a suffocating sense of dread. The words were garbled, like a language I couldn't understand, but the tone was unmistakably sinister. I backed away, my heart racing, and as I did, I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, moving across the floor upstairs, toward my parents' bedroom. But there was no one upstairs except my parents, and they were sound asleep. The realization hit me like a cold wave. The footsteps weren't theirs. I bolted out of the kitchen and up the stairs, my mind a blur of fear and confusion. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if they were coming from just behind me. I could feel something cold and malevolent breathing down my neck, and the hairs on my arms stood on end. I burst into my parents' room, flinging the door open with enough force to make it bang against the wall. "Mom! Dad!" I cried, my voice trembling. I ran to their bed and shook them awake, my hands still shaking from the adrenaline. "Something's in the house. It's the doll." My parents groggily sat up, blinking in the darkness. My mother reached for the lamp on her bedside table and flicked it on, flooding the room with light. My father rubbed his eyes, clearly struggling to wake up. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice thick with sleep. "The doll," I stammered. "It was in the kitchen and something pushed me and I heard whispers." My parents exchanged a glance. My mother placed a comforting hand on my shoulder, her expression softening. "Honey, it was just a bad dream," she said gently. "The doll is probably still in your room. Let's go back to bed, okay?" But I shook my head furiously. "No, I'm not making it up. I'm telling the truth." My father sighed, getting out of bed. "All right, let's go check the kitchen," he said, clearly not convinced, but willing to indulge me. "We'll take a look, and then we can all go back to sleep." The three of us made our way down the hallway, my parents moving at a much more relaxed pace than I was. I clutched my mother's arm, my eyes darting around the dark corners of the house, expecting something to leap out at us at any moment. The whispers had stopped, but the house felt charged, like the air before a storm. We reached the kitchen, and I pointed to the counter where I'd seen the doll, but to my horror, it wasn't there anymore. The counter was empty, save for the shattered glass on the floor. I felt my stomach drop, my mind racing. Had I imagined it? No, I couldn't have. The pain in my hands was real enough. My father sighed, bending down to pick up the larger pieces of glass. "See? There's no doll here. You probably knocked over the glass in your sleepwalking." "I wasn't sleepwalking," I insisted, frustration and fear bubbling up inside me. "I saw it. It was right there." My mother knelt beside me, examining the cuts on my hands. "Let's get you cleaned up," she said softly, "and then we'll go back to bed. You'll feel better in the morning." But as she spoke, something in the room shifted. The temperature dropped and the air grew thick, almost suffocating. My parents seemed to notice it too, their expressions changing from concern to confusion. Then the whispers returned. This time they were louder, more insistent, and they were accompanied by a new sound, a soft, shuffling noise, like something dragging across the floor. My father stood up, looking around the room, his expression hardening. "What in the world?" he muttered under his breath. The shuffling grew louder, coming from the hallway now. My parents and I turned as one, and there, in the doorway, was the doll. It stood upright, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, its blue eyes gleaming in the dim light. The doll's mouth, which had always been a simple, painted line, seemed to be twisted into a malicious grin. My mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, while my father took a step back, his face pale. For a moment, none of us moved, too shocked to react. Then, as if by some unspoken agreement, we all moved at once. My father lunged for the doll, grabbing it by the arm. The doll's head snapped around to face him, and for a brief, horrifying moment, I thought I saw its eyes narrow in anger. He carried it to the basement door, my mother and I following close behind. My father yanked open the door and descended the creaky wooden stairs, the doll dangling limply in his grasp. He reached the bottom and threw the doll into an old storage trunk that had been sitting in the corner for as long as I could remember. He slammed the lid shut, locking it with a padlock that was rusty but functional. My mother had to practically drag me up the stairs, my legs feeling like they were made of lead. The whispers had stopped, and the house felt eerily quiet, but the fear lingered like a bad taste in my mouth. Once we were back upstairs, my parents tried to reassure me, but I could see the fear in their eyes. They didn't know what to make of what had just happened, and neither did I. All I knew was that the doll was locked away in the basement, and I hoped I would never have to see it again. We all slept in the same room that night, the lights on and the door firmly closed. None of us spoke about what had just happened, and I could tell my parents were struggling to process it. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, too afraid to close my eyes. Every creak of the house made my heart race, and every shadow seemed to hold some unseen threat. The next morning, my father nailed the basement door shut. "Just to be safe," he said with a strained smile. We didn't talk about the doll again, not even as the years passed and I grew older. The basement became a forbidden place, a part of the house we avoided at all costs. Even when my friends came over, I would make excuses not to go down there. Eventually, we moved to a new house, and the old one was sold to another family. I never asked what happened to the doll. I didn't want to know. But sometimes, late at night, I would wake up with a start, convinced that I could hear those whispers again, just at the edge of my hearing. And in my nightmares, the doll was always there, staring at me with those cold... It was late October, and the night was as cold and dark as I'd ever felt. I had just finished a long shift at the hospital and was driving home, the only light coming from the headlights cutting through the dense fog that clung to the ground. The road was deserted, narrow strip of asphalt winding through the hills and forests that surrounded my small town. I was exhausted, the kind of bone-deep fatigue that made my eyes heavy and my thoughts slow. All I wanted was to get home, crawl into bed, and let sleep take me. But as I rounded a sharp curve, something caught my attention. A sound, faint at first, but unmistakable. It was the sound of a child crying. I immediately slowed down, straining to hear over the hum of the engine. The crying was soft, pitiful, like a child who was lost and scared. My heart skipped a beat. Out here, in the middle of nowhere, at this hour? It didn't make any sense, but the thought of a child alone in the dark, crying for help, sent a surge of adrenaline through me. I pulled over to the side of the road and killed the engine. The crying continued, faint but persistent, seeming to come from somewhere just beyond the tree line. I sat there for a moment, debating whether to investigate. Every rational part of me screamed that this was a bad idea, that I should call someone, anyone, but the crying tugged at my heartstrings in a way I couldn't ignore. Grabbing my flashlight from the glove compartment, I stepped out of the car. The cold air bit at my skin, and I shivered, pulling my jacket tighter around me. The woods were dense, the trees tall and menacing in the pale light of the moon. The crying continued, seeming so close yet so far away at the same time. I took a deep breath and started walking toward the sound. The forest swallowed me up almost immediately, the trees closing in like the walls of a labyrinth. The ground was uneven, littered with fallen leaves that crunched underfoot. The further I went, the louder the crying became, though it was still distant, as if the child was moving deeper into the woods. I kept walking, flashlight cutting through the darkness in a narrow beam. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. "Is someone there? Do you need help?" The crying stopped suddenly, plunging the forest into an oppressive silence. I froze, the flashlight trembling in my hand as I scanned the trees around me. The silence was unnerving, the kind that made your skin crawl and your instincts scream that something was terribly wrong. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. "Hello?" I called again, my voice barely more than a whisper now. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. I could hear my own breathing, loud in the stillness. For a moment, I considered turning back, returning to the safety of my car and leaving this place behind. But then the crying started again, this time louder and more frantic, as if the child was in real pain. It was coming from somewhere up ahead, deeper into the forest. I forced myself to move, pushing through the thick underbrush, my heart hammering in my chest. Every instinct told me to turn back, that something was wrong. But the thought of a child in danger drove me forward. The crying grew louder, closer, until I was sure I was almost on top of it. And then, just as suddenly as before, it stopped. I came to a halt, my breath coming in short gasps, my ears straining for any sound. The forest was silent again, but this time it felt different. The air was thick with tension. I felt like I was being watched, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. Slowly, I swept the flashlight around me, the beam slicing through the darkness, and that's when I noticed the thing. At first, I thought it had to be some kind of dark shadow, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized it was something else entirely. There, half hidden behind a tree, was the creature. It was unnaturally tall, and its limbs were elongated, almost grotesque in their proportions. The thing had the shape of a person, but something was horribly wrong with it. The creature stepped out from behind the tree, moving with a jerky, unnatural motion. The flashlight beam caught its face, and I felt my stomach drop. The face was wrong, like a mask that didn't quite fit. The eyes were too large, the mouth too wide, stretched into some kind of unnatural expression that almost looked like a grin that sent a chill down my spine. The skin was pale, almost translucent, and there was something off about the way it moved, as if it were mimicking the motions of a human but didn't quite understand how. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The creature tilted its head, watching me with those unnervingly large eyes. And then it opened its mouth. The sound that came out wasn't human. It was the same crying I had heard before, but distorted, as if it were being played backward through a broken speaker. I turned and ran. I didn't care about the flashlight anymore. I didn't care about anything except getting to safety as soon as possible, getting back to my car. My feet pounded against the ground, and the branches seemed to tear around my face and arms. I could still hear it there, its fake crying noise, trying to beckon me back to it. Panic surged through me, and I had to force myself to run faster. My breath was ragged, and my lungs were burning hard, but I didn't stop for even a moment. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The trees were blurring around me, and there were several moments when I almost tripped over myself, but I caught myself just in time. At long last, I burst out of the forest and onto the road. My car was there, just a few feet away, the headlights still cutting through the fog. I sprinted toward it, throwing myself inside and slamming the door shut. My hands were shaking so badly that it took me 3 tries to get the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I floored the gas pedal. The car lurched forward, tires squealing as I sped down the road. I didn't look back. I couldn't. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The crying had stopped, but the silence that followed was even worse. I kept driving, my heart racing, the fear still clawing at my insides. I didn't slow down until I reached the outskirts of town, where the streetlights cast a comforting glow over the road. I pulled over, my hands still shaking, and tried to catch my breath. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had happened, but there was no rational explanation for what I'd seen. No way to explain the creature in the woods. For days I was haunted by the encounter. I couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on anything. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that thing, its twisted face and those horrible hollow eyes staring at me from the darkness. The memory of its distorted crying echoed in my mind, sending chills down my spine. I tried to tell myself that it had been a hallucination, some kind of trick of the light, but deep down I knew the truth. A few days after the encounter, I heard about a missing child in the area, a little girl who had disappeared a week before my encounter. Her parents had searched everywhere, but she had vanished without a trace. The news made my blood run cold. I couldn't help but wonder if what I'd heard in the forest that night had something to do with her disappearance. I never went back to that stretch of road. I avoided the forest altogether, even in broad daylight. I couldn't bring myself to drive past that spot, to risk hearing crying again. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the memories. They haunted me, a constant reminder of the horrors that lurked just beyond the edge of the forest. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that the creature is still out there, waiting in the shadows, crying out in the dark, luring in anyone who is foolish enough to follow the sound. And I know that if I had stayed in those woods just a little bit longer, I might have never made it out alive. I was 8 when I first saw it, the thing that haunted me in the night. It started with little things a kid like me would brush off as nightmares or the tricks of a restless imagination. I would wake up in the middle of the night to a strange, soft rustling sound, like someone was walking through leaves. My room would be cold, colder than the rest of the house, and I'd lie there under my covers, staring into the dark corners of my room where the nightlight didn't reach. My parents always told me it was nothing. They said, "You're just dreaming, honey," whenever I ran to the room, my little feet pounding against the floor in a panic. They tuck me back into bed, kiss my forehead, and leave, the house settling into its usual eerie silence. But I could never fall back asleep right away. I would lie there, listening, waiting for that sound to start up again. The soft rustling, almost like whispering, coming from the shadows. At first, it was easy to convince myself it wasn't real. After all, my parents said so. It's just a bad dream. Nothing real, all just some kind of trick I'm playing on my mind. But one night, when they were gone, and I was all alone in the house, something happened that remains in my mind and will never leave me. Something I'll never forget. My parents had gone out for dinner, leaving me behind with a promise that they'd be back before midnight. I wasn't worried. I was a big kid. I could handle it. They'd left the TV on in the living room, and I fell asleep to the muffled sounds of cartoons. I don't know how long I was out, but I woke up to that familiar, unnerving cold. It was as if the air had been sucked out of the room, replaced with something heavy, something thick that pressed down on me from all sides. I pulled my blanket tighter around me, listening. My heart started to pound in my chest as the rustling began again, just like it always did, coming from the corner of my room. This time, though, it wasn't just a sound. I could see something, movement, just at the edge of my vision. I held my breath and looked toward the darkest corner of the room, just beyond the reach of my nightlight. And there, standing, was something terrifying. At first, it was just a shadow, almost shapeless, drifting along the wall like a trick of the light. But the more I stared, the more I realized it wasn't a shadow at all. It had mass, substance. It was moving slowly at first, but then it stopped, as if it noticed I was watching it for the first time ever. My heart was beating so fast I could barely hear anything over the sound of my own pulse. I couldn't make out its face or any details, but I knew something was there, crouched in the corner, watching me. Part of me wondered why, but the rest just wanted to leave. My voice came out in a shaky whisper. barely loud enough to hear. "Who's there?" The shadow didn't move at first. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined it, that my eyes were playing tricks on me. But then it shifted, its form stretching, twisting as it rose up from the floor. It was tall, too tall to fit in the room comfortably, and its limbs were long and spindly, like it had too many joints that bent the wrong way. The thing stepped into the dim light from my nightlight, and I saw its face, if you could even call it a face. Its eyes were empty, dark holes that seemed to suck in the light around them, and its mouth was a wide, jagged line, twisted into something that resembled a grin, but was far too wide and far too long to be anything human. Its skin was pale and translucent, almost like it had been stretched too tightly over bones that were sharper and more angular than they should have been. Honestly, it looked like a ghost, but creepier. It was a strange way. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't scream. I was frozen in place, staring at the creature as it loomed over me, its head tilting to one side as though it was studying me, waiting for me to move. Then, as if some switch had flipped inside of me, I screamed. I screamed louder than I ever had in my life, the sound ripping from my throat in a desperate plea for help. I never knew my voice could even reach the heights it did, or sound as erratic as it was. My body snapped out of its frozen state, and I threw myself under the covers, hoping, praying that they would protect me from whatever was standing in the middle of my room. The blankets felt heavy, like they were holding me down instead of shielding me. I heard the thing moving closer. Its footsteps, soft but deliberate, like it knew I had nowhere to go. My heart pounded in my chest, and I clenched my eyes shut, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Then, with a violent yank, the covers were ripped off of me. The cold air hit my skin, and I was left exposed, staring up at the ceiling, too terrified to move. I could feel it standing beside the bed, its breath hot and ragged, the weight of its presence pressing down on me. I didn't think, I just acted. I rolled out of bed, hit the floor hard, and scrambled to my feet. I could hear it moving behind me, but I didn't stop. I bolted for the door, my hands shaking so badly I nearly fumbled with the doorknob. I flung the door open and ran down the hallway, my bare feet slapping against the cold hardwood floor. My first instinct was to run to my parents' room, to pound on their door and beg them to let me in. But then, as I reached the door, my heart sank. I remembered. They weren't home. They were out at dinner, and they wouldn't be back for hours. I was alone. I pressed my back against the door, gasping for breath, trying to figure out what to do. The house was deathly quiet, but I could feel it. Feel the thing moving through the hallway, looking for me. My eyes darted around, searching for a place to hide. The closet? No, it would find me there. The bathroom? Maybe, but I'd be trapped. The only option left was the hallway closet, the one at the end, near the stairs. Without thinking, I sprinted toward it, throwing open the door and diving inside. I shut it behind me and crouched down, pulling my knees to my chest, trying to make myself as small as possible. The closet was cramped, filled with old coats and boxes of things my parents had stored away over the years. I buried myself under the coats, holding my breath, listening. At first, there was nothing, just silence. But then I heard it, the slow, deliberate creak of footsteps on the floorboards outside. I pressed myself further into the darkness, praying that it wouldn't find me. The footsteps grew closer, and I heard the soft rustle of something dragging across the floor. It was searching for me, moving through the hallway, checking every room. I clammed my hand over my mouth, trying to stifle the sound of my breathing. I have no idea how long I stayed in that closet, but it felt like hours. The footsteps stopped outside the closet door, and for a moment, I thought it had found me. But then the sound faded away, growing distant until there was nothing but silence again. I don't remember falling asleep, but I must have, because the next thing I knew, I was being shaken awake. My mom's face was hovering over mine, her eyes wide with concern. "Sweetheart, wake up," she said, her voice trembling. "Are you okay?" I blinked, disoriented, my heart still pounding in my chest. I was still in the closet, curled up under a pile of coats, and for a brief moment, I thought I had dreamed the whole thing. But then I saw my dad standing in the doorway, his face pale, and I knew it wasn't a dream. "I saw it," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "The thing in my room, it tried to get me." My parents exchanged a glance, and I could see the worry in their eyes. My dad knelt down beside me, his hand on my shoulder. "We need to tell you something," he said, his voice quiet. "Something we probably should have told you a long time ago." I had no idea what he was about to say, but the look on his face told me it wasn't good. "This house," my dad began, hesitating for a moment. "It was built over an old cemetery a long time ago. We didn't think it mattered. We didn't think anything would happen. But, well, strange things have happened here before." My breath caught in my throat. "You knew?" I whispered, my voice shaking. "You knew, and you didn't tell me?" "We didn't want to scare you," my mom said, her voice soft. "We didn't think anything would happen. But maybe we were wrong." I stared at them, my mind racing. The thing I'd seen, the shadow, the creature, it wasn't just a nightmare. It was real, more than real. And it had come from the ground beneath our house, the place where the dead had been buried long ago. My parents tried to reassure me. Their words felt hollow. I knew the truth now. The house wasn't safe. Something was here, something that wasn't going to leave. And every night, as I'd lie in bed, I could still hear it. The soft rustling, the whisper of something moving in the dark, waiting for me to fall asleep. Because it wasn't done with me yet. Hope you enjoyed that story, and I'll see you in the next one. See you on the flip side.